Geoffrey, we heard there from Lord Goldsmith he was Attorney General at the time, making it clear that the advice he was giving wasn't terribly welcome. But then we should add, he changed the advice just a few days before the start of the war.
He did,
said,
after his arm had been twisted in Washington. But I think this is...
Well, he says his arm wasn't twisted.
Well, that's right, but he changed his advice, and Britain and Australia went to war, and hundreds of thousands died as a result, although fortunately no Australians did. Several hundred British soldiers did, and this is an independent inquiry into the wisdom of going to war and the legality of that war. And I think it's a very important moment for not just for Tony Blair, but for democratic accountability. Because,
why is it important? Why are we arguing so many years later about the legality?
Well, it's not so many years. It's only 5 or 6 years later. Those who made the decisions and those who advised on the decisions, these Whitehall mandarins, the yes minister characters, are all being flushed out. Their memoranda are open for all to see. In Australia, you don't get these documents for 30 years under the 30-year rule. Well, here, accountability, the cabinet ministers and leading civil servants are being held to account, not just legally but morally, by an independent inquiry. The Chilcott inquiry is made up of people who have no truck with the particular political parties. They're not politicians, they're historians and former ambassadors and so forth. And what the British public is learning in a way that it never learnt over Suez or any other major action is what exactly was the thinking behind going to a war that was disastrous for many people.
It's one thing to learn what was the thinking about it. The other point is whether it was legal or not. What do you think people will learn when Tony Blair gives evidence today?
Well, what they will learn is certainly that the experts, the preponderance of opinion was that it was unlawful. On the other hand, what they will also, I think, Tony Blair will tell them today, is that international law is not quite the same as national law. It doesn't have a police force. And indeed, there is no crime of aggression. We're going to get round to defining that at a conference later this year, so that doing something unlawful doesn't mean that you're ever going to be held at the moment to account for it. Britain is the only country of the 5 major powers that actually believes enough in international law to be amenable to the World Court. France pulled out after Australia took it to the World Court over its nuclear tests. So in one sense, that can provide a defence. On the other hand, since Britain is the true believer in international law, it might have been better if instead of going along with the Americans, Britain had taken a moral and legal position that without a second Security Council resolution, it wouldn't join. I think a lot of the evidence so far from those who've given it to the Chilcott inquiry suggests that Britain supported the American position really because they were fearful that if America went it alone, it wouldn't be held to the Geneva Conventions, and that somehow that if Britain joined, they'd be able to restrain the Americans. Well, of course, that didn't turn out to be the case.
There may be many motivations for why Tony Blair seemed to sign on very early in the piece, early in 2002, to join George Bush in a war against Iraq, but there is still mixed views about whether the war is legal or not, whether the UN resolution that was in place was enough to give a cover of legality.
No, I think it was what lawyers call arguable. And when lawyers say you've got an arguable case, they mean I'll take your money for arguing it, but we won't win. I think that was really the position for the fallback, rather legalistic position. But the reality was that there needed to be a second resolution. There wasn't. We went, or at least Britain and Australia, joined the American decision to invade, and I think Tony Blair bears the brunt of the responsibility for taking that decision. I'm sure he'll explain it carefully today, but I think it boils down to a belief in what the ancient Romans called tyrannicide. He believed that Saddam Hussein was such a dreadful tyrant that the world was entitled to overthrow him. Now, that may be a view that you and I would agree with in the long term. The problem is we don't have a convention that that says if someone behaves so badly, if you get a Mugabe or a Taliban, that there is a basis for removing them for what is called regime change. Obviously, we need to move towards that position, and while international law isn't binding at the moment, and there'll be no prosecutions as a result of unlawful behaviour, we need to move towards a situation where there will be.
It goes to the nub of it, though, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, legal or not, Tony Blair and George Bush and John Howard thought it was the right thing to do. They thought, even though they weren't really, most of them, certainly not John Howard and Tony Blair, really talking about regime change up front. They're certainly happy to defend it
yes,
post-war, and a lot of people would support them. If they had their time again, they'd do it again. That's what they said.
Well, I think most of them wouldn't, actually, and most of those who've given evidence to Chilcott accept that they've learnt lessons from it. I think the decisions that were made in retrospect were partly a result of faulty intelligence, and the intelligence services have a great deal to answer for, because a lot of the material that they were supplying to politicians was utterly mistaken. Saddam Hussein, of course, was pretending that he had weapons of mass destruction in order to frighten Iran, his great enemy. There was a failure of analysis, failure to see that the Ba'athist Party in Iraq was actually, as a secular party, a good deal better prospect than the theocratic mullahs in Iran, and so that was another failure. There were many failures that contributed to this position where we, in effect, said, well, he must have weapons of mass destruction. We're not going to wait for Hans Blix to find out whether he really does. We're going in to an American timetable, and that was, of course, in retrospect, the bad thing to do. But ultimately, I think the message that comes from events like today is that, first of all, they are a development of the idea of democratic accountability. Leaders should be put through the ringer and should be required retrospectively to justify policies that have not been effective.
It is quite amazing to watch that in action, isn't it? I watched it during the Hutton inquiry, Tony Blair appearing, and he'll appear. I mean, it is quite extraordinary to see.
That's right. I mean, maybe John Howard should be invited together with his advisors to appear and answer questions about what their real thinking was, because it was quite plain that the British leaders who were saying, oh, we can't go in and just change the regime, were in fact believed that that was the moral position which they were covering up with the more legalistic view that he had weapons of mass destruction, which of course it turned out that he didn't.
So is that something gained by this, a trend towards more accountability, democratic transparency?
What else
great
things
in terms
will
of
come out of
law?
it. I think, first of all, the democratic accountability, the responsibility of leaders, even once they're out of office, to fess up and to explain themselves where policies have gone wrong.
Isn't that what memoirs are for?
Not in the varnished and heavily censored memoirs that tend to come out. And secondly, it will concentrate people's mind on the importance of international law. I don't think we'll go to war again where the advice of the experts is that it is a breach of international law. I think the greater importance of international law has already been signalled in this inquiry.
That's a very optimistic view. If you think we won't go to war again with greater legal
well, it'll be more difficult. I think it will flag up the importance of the United Nations and of having an international legal system. This is across a whole range of things. This is
why do you think that, though, given, as you say, international law isn't binding? I mean, why do you think that?
Well, it's not at the moment, and that's the problem. And I think Britain and Australia have signed up to a view of the future in which international law is, and international justice is going to be important. And that's why we put Milosevic on trial, we have Charles Taylor and others on trial at the moment. But we're never going to, of course, get a question of prosecuting Tony Blair or Dr. Kissinger or Mr. Bush, but let's work towards a position where one day leaders of even important nations will be vulnerable to prosecution if they breach international law.